Good evening, and welcome back. I'm so glad you're here. Tonight, we are stepping into deep water to meet a creature that haunted some of the oldest stories we have. Leviathan. If you have never heard of Leviathan, the name comes to us from the Hebrew Bible, where it appears in books like Job, Psalms, and Isaiah as a vast sea creature that embodies chaos. It has older roots in Near Eastern myth, related to the Canaanite serpent Lotan and comparable to the great dragon Tiamat of Mesopotamia. In these traditions, Leviathan is not a natural animal you could net and weigh. It is a symbol of the untamed sea, a force that gods subdue to make an orderly world. Later, readers tried to match it to real creatures such as crocodiles or whales, and modern imagination sometimes treats it like a prehistoric superpredator. But for the ancient world, Leviathan was a way to talk about fear, power, creation, and the limits of human control. As always, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from and what time it is for you. Whether you are winding down for the night or just curious about the oldest corners of myth, I am glad you are here. Now, let us begin. Before there were maps to soothe our fears and neat lines to contain our oceans, there was only the deep. Darkness lay upon the face of the waters, and a silence as old as time listened for a word. When the word came, it was not a shout, but an act of elegant will. Light, sky, and sea took their places. Creatures swarmed. Among them was one that cared nothing for our tidy categories. Later generations would give it a name that coils upon the tongue as it coils in the sea. Leviathan, the twisted one. The Book of Beginnings tells us that God made the great sea creatures. It does not pause to measure them or to itemize their species. Scripture is confident enough to declare wonder and move on. Yet the teachers of Israel, who were old friends of wonder, lingered. They said that in the first days there were two Leviathans, a pair in the primeval waters, the Holy One, who makes worlds and understands their tolerances better than any engineer, foresaw that if such creatures multiplied, the balance of creation would tip into ruin. So the female was slain and salted, her flesh preserved for a banquet at the end of the age, a feast not of gluttony but of victory, when terror itself will be carved and shared among the faithful. One Leviathan remained, singular as a mountain, and no friend to scales or nets. If you wish to know what it looked like, imagine a serpent big enough to tie a bow around the horizon. Where other creatures had skins, this one had armor. Its scales fit together so closely that even a whisper could not slip between them. When it turned, the sea turned with it. Currents curled from its passage like the hems of a great robe. Its eyes were twin dawns buried in the deep, and their pale fire could be glimpsed by sailors who had the misfortune to sail too far, and the fortune to survive and tell of it. The sea has many tempers, and some of them belong to weather. But the ancient world knew in its bones that certain tempests had a heart, and that heart beat in the breast of Leviathan. Do not mistake it for a rival to God. This is not the tale of two equal powers wrestling for a throne. Leviathan is a creature. Its scale and savagery do not make it divine. They make it useful, a living parable with teeth. It is creation at its most untamable, the part of the world that refuses to sit still for a portrait, the wave that rises when you have just told yourself that the sea is calm. By making Leviathan, God set into the world a truth that men often forget, that order is chosen and maintained, and that chaos is not an error but a presence under command. Its name tells us something of its nature. Leviathan twists, it winds, it folds in upon itself like rope on a capstan, or like a storm seen from the height of heaven. In that turning there is beauty and there is menace, for the spiral is pattern and threat both at once. The poets in Israel spoke of the deep with another name, Tehom, the abyss that yawns beneath the planks of every ship and the hopes of every harbor. Leviathan belongs to Tehom as a lion belongs to its plain. It is at home there, and the waters, which love to be wild, love Leviathan as one of their own, Some of the elders said it fed as no other creature fed. Whales, which for us are already the measure of enormity, were for it a midday snack. At its breath the surface foamed and grew hot, and the fish that swam too near were poached by a furnace they could not see. This was not said to terrify children, it was said to instruct adults. A world filled with predictable domestic beasts would be a comforting place and a dull one. The presence of Leviathan makes the oceans honest. To cross them is to admit that bravery is not an absence of fear but a decision in the presence of it. The theologians, among the storytellers, enjoyed a further point. If there exists a creature that man cannot hunt, cannot harness, cannot even look upon without his knees warning him to flee, then power has a different address than we imagine. Authority does not reside in the harpoon, nor in the nerve to throw it. Authority resides in the one who thought Leviathan into being and set bounds to its realm. The existence of such a beast is not a flaw in the code of creation. It is a feature, a reminder written in the ink of salt and storm that human mastery is local, and that awe is a proper human posture. So we leave Leviathan for a moment, as it was in the beginning, newborn and terrible, turning in the black cradle of the sea. Above it, the sky is clear and innocent. The first birds are learning the trick of air, and somewhere on the empty shore, the first wave withdraws and leaves its shining signature on untouched sand. The world has been made. Within it swims a secret that the ages will try to name. Leviathan waits, not sleeping, for a story that is older than history and younger than hope. In the beginning, the sea had no manners. It surged where it liked, voiced itself without being asked, and sloshed against the edges of the world as if the tablecloth of creation were a napkin to be stained and wrung. Into this rehearsal of uproar came a summons older than storms. The Maker spoke, and borders awoke. Light found its line. Dry land cleared its throat and rose. The sea, however, kept the memory of chaos like salt in its blood, and in that saline memory, a singular creature turned in slow authority. Leviathan was not a rumor, it was a fact. It was the fact that water could still become a wall, that darkness could still learn to breathe fire, that the deep could still have a will of its own. The first confrontation was not a duel between equals. The ancient singers were adamant about that. In their songs, the Lord does not brandish a weapon out of fear. He brandishes it the way an artist lifts a brush, calm and certain of the design. Yet they did not shy from battle words. They said the heads of Leviathan were broken, heads, plural, as if the great serpent had braided itself into 7 crowns, and each one had to be silenced in turn. Imagine the scene not as a chaos of flailing, but as a terrible choreography. The sky holds its breath. The sea arches its back. The Maker steps to the edge of the waters, and lays down a line that the ocean must not cross. What does a divine sword look like when it meets a creature that swims in myth and heat and pressure? Do not think of iron. Think of decree. Think of a word sharp enough to cut a wave and leave 2 seas where there had been one. The strike is spoken. The waters recoil. The coils of the serpent slip and snag. The white of the breakers becomes the white of bone and the white of surrender. The many heads fall like corrupt crowns, and the spray turns bright as glass. In the speech of poets, this is the moment when the ancient dragon is slain. In the speech of theologians, this is the establishment of sovereignty. Both say the same thing. The sea is told what it is, and Leviathan learns that it is a creature and not a king. The battle is written into the map of the world. We can still read it. Look at a shoreline, any shoreline, the clean curve where water desires to wander and land refuses to move. Those are not the accidents of erosion. Those are the marks of the day when the ocean was given a room and a door. The old story says the Lord shut in the sea with bars and set gates upon its tumult. He addressed the waves the way a parent addresses a beloved child who will not sleep. Here your proud waves shall stop. The thunder subsides, not because thunder is tired, but because it has been given a bedtime. No spear of man is thrown in this fight. The texts take pleasure in reminding us that hooks and cords and ropes are playthings beside the hide of Leviathan. Nothing in the arsenal of hunters can make this beast perform tricks. When the Creator speaks, that is another matter. There is a fisher's parable hidden in the rhetoric. Can you draw out Leviathan with a line? You cannot, but the one who made its gills can. If the Lord pleases, the mouth that kindles coals becomes a mouth that opens to a command. The ring passed through those jaws is not bronze, it is providence. The singers remembered more than victory, they remembered distribution. The broken power of the serpent does not vanish into thin air. It becomes provisions for the wilderness. It becomes, in one startling image, food for desert wanderers who will never see the sea but will taste its pacification. The image is strange and beautiful. What once threatened to swallow the world is diced and served to the hungry. Order is not only a wall against chaos, it is also a kitchen. Do not let the pageantry distract you from the theology concealed under its scales. In the Hebrew telling, there is no contest among gods. There is the Maker, who is not a character in a pantheon, and there is creation, which arrives in chorus. Leviathan is part of the chorus. It has a magnificent solo. It may take the low, rumbling line that frightens the audience, yet it swells where it is told to swell, and it resolves when the conductor lowers a hand. The old poets wanted you to feel this. They wanted you to feel the awe that comes from seeing a thing too big for your net being turned by a thought too quiet for your ears. It helps to understand that the deep in these stories is not just a basin of salt. It is a personality. The deep loves to be wild. When the Maker calls it good, he does not mean tame. He means fitted. Fitted to a purpose. The first battle is the fitting. The sea is dressed for its role. The serpent is reminded of its place. The sky looks on, cool and high. Land steadies itself for gardens and graves. The stars that will later guide sailors spin in their first astonishment. Now see the aftermath, which is sometimes more instructive than the event. The beast is not simply annihilated. One Leviathan remains. The text is firm about that. The world does not need the return of primeval fury in a breeding multitude, but it does require a single specimen to haunt its edges. So the serpent is bound to the abyss. Bound does not mean chained in iron. It means allowed and limited. It means a territory is marked with divine chalk, and the monster is told that if it touches the line, there will be consequences. In this way, the ocean continues to be itself. It can still terrify. It can still astonish. It can still swallow ships and men who mistake bravado for wisdom. But it cannot unmake what was made. It cannot rise above its permit. There is a further quiet glory in the binding. By setting a limit to the deep, God gives freedom to everything that is not the deep. Shores can have villages. Rivers can find their mouths without being eaten alive. Children can collect shells. Fishermen can risk and return. The history of ordinary courage begins the moment Leviathan is sent back to its room. We often honor the gods of storm and mountain and sky in the abstract. The Hebrew poets honor God also for the continued existence of harbors. Scholars like to remark that many nations around Israel told stories of a dragon beaten by a champion of the heavens. The Hebrews kept the drama and stripped it of rivalry. This is not a change for mere tidiness. It is the central affirmation. If there were two equal powers, the world would be a field of permanent stalemate. With one sovereign, the world is a place that can be loved. Leviathan becomes not a cosmic accident, not a shadow government hissing from the brine, but an instrument. A dangerous instrument, yes, like fire or lightning, but an instrument nonetheless. The battle is not an episode that embarrassed the divine court. It is part of the architecture. Picture the last image of that day. The water lies back upon itself, defeated and content. The serpent sinks, furious and listening. It curls in its chosen trench, a kilometer below daylight, coiling and uncoiling in slow dreams of crowns that have been broken. Above, men who do not yet exist will one day sail and swear and sing, They will tell each other about lights that move beneath the surface, and about a sudden heat that makes foam shiver like breath on glass. They will not be wrong. The memory of the first battle ripples through every tide. It is why the shore knows where to stop, and why our fear of the deep has the dignity of religion rather than the panic of superstition. We fear a thing that once had to be taught its place by the only one who could teach it. So the first battle is not an ended legend. It is a present tense. Every boundary you can draw with your finger in a tide pool. Every harbor that holds when the storm pushes at the jetty. Every time a fisherman says a quiet prayer when the prow lifts and the horizon goes crooked, they are all footnotes to the moment when the sea met its match. Leviathan is still down there, not sleeping, waiting. The Maker is still above, no less near for being unseen, and the line between them is still as bright as the first command. The sea keeps many books, and each wave speaks a different language. When people came to its edge to name what frightened them, the names changed from shore to shore, but the shape beneath those names was strangely constant. In the Hebrew tongue, the word is Leviathan, a name that tastes of salt and turns in the mouth the way a current turns around a headland. In the speech of Israel's neighbors, there are other words that circle the same silhouette in the deep. If you listen long enough, you begin to hear how the languages argue with one another and yet point to the same vast creature, a serpent whose coils can girdle a world and whose presence at the bottom of things makes the surface a little less secure than we pretend. Begin with the name given by the poets of Israel. Leviathan, Leviathan. It is a word that derives from a root meaning to twist or to wind. You can almost see it while you say it. A rope coiling on a deck, a storm seen from the height of heaven, a dragon binding itself into a knot only to unfurl like a banner across the seafloor. In the Psalms, the name is not a casual ornament. It carries weight. One singer remembers a primordial victory and declares that the Lord broke the heads of Leviathan and gave the broken thing as food for those who wandered far from the sea. Another praises the Lord as the one who made Leviathan to frolic in the waters, which is a sentence that has made scholars and children smile for centuries because it holds terror and playfulness side by side without apology. When Isaiah takes up the old name, he coins titles that are not decorative but diagnostic. He speaks of Leviathan the fleeing serpent and Leviathan the twisting serpent, as if he wants you to see both speed and torque, the two ways a snake makes itself dreadful, and then he adds the phrase, the dragon that is in the sea, to make sure no one mistakes this for a dry land legend. Hebrew has other words that shine through the same glass. There is tannin, plural tanninim, a broad term for sea dragons and monstrous things that live where a net will not reach. There is Rahab, a poetic name for the sea as an embattled force, which later becomes a way to speak about arrogant empires that rage like a storm and go down like a sinking ship. There is the old and resonant term Tehom, the deep, the yawning place beneath every keel and every certainty. These are not aliases in a tidy dictionary. They are facets, showing how the people of Israel understood the sea and its sovereign in a way that was both like and unlike their neighbors. Like, because every culture around that sea drew the same dragon on the same map. Unlike, because in Israel that dragon was always a creature and never a god. Now turn the listening ear eastward to the city-states that love to raise towers and write poetry on clay. On the coast of Canaan there are tablets, the color of old sand, that speak a language the scholars call Ugaritic. In this tongue, a storm god battles a sea god with a name that is simply sea made personal. The sea god has servants, and among them is a dragon called Leviathan, and sometimes the scribes write the words in full dress as the fleeing serpent and the twisting serpent. They also call this serpent the one of 7 heads. The resemblance to Isaiah's poetry is not an accident of wind and tide. The Hebrews lived near these stories, as they lived near the sea. They knew the cadence. They felt the pull. They could read the inscription as well as the fishermen who carved their prayers into the wood of their boats. Yet when the old Hebrew poets borrowed the music, they changed the key. In the Ugaritic songs, the storm god comes into his kingship by wrestling with the sea. In the biblical songs, the Lord is already king. There is no election night, no contest of cousins, only sovereignty from the first word forward. The borrowed phrases become trophies. The fleeing serpent and the twisting serpent are not rival divine households. They are, in the Hebrew version, the trophies of the one who set the boundary between wave and shore. Where the Canaanite tale presents a struggle that secures a throne, the Israelite tale presents a proclamation that announces a throne already secured. The dragon is not reincarnated divine chaos. It is an actor who can be killed and preserved and fed out in rations to the desert poor. Beyond Canaan there are long rivers that empty their myths into the same sea. Mesopotamian poets spoke of a goddess who was also the salt sea itself. She bore a brood of monsters. The sky-splitting hero slew her and used her body to fashion the world. If you read those lines beside the Hebrew account, you will feel the family resemblance and then the decisive distance. The resemblance lies in the image of a monster associated with the sea and the beginnings of things. The distance lies in the message. In the Babylonian poem, the world is built upon a corpse. In the Hebrew poems, the world is called good without remainder. There is no divine cadaver holding up the firmament. There is only a teeming of life under blessing. And if a corpse appears at the end of time, it is the corpse of Leviathan served at a feast that is a sacrament of peace. The Hebrews know the old mythic grammar, but they write their theology in a new tense. The Greek-speaking world that sails the blue water to the west also loved a sea monster. Their word is Ketos. It shows its teeth in tragedies and in carvings on temple stones. It is the beast that threatens heroes and princesses and gives the poets an opportunity for the bravura entrance of a rescuer whose timing is excellent and whose sword is clean. In Greek hands, the sea monster is an occasion for adventure. In Hebrew hands, it is an occasion for theology and for wisdom. The difference is not a judgment on the quality of Greek stories. It is a recognition that the Hebrew storytellers are not after applause when they make Leviathan coil and glitter on the page. They are after a truth that the heart must learn the way a sailor learns the feel of a keel in a cross-current. To see how Israel stored this knowledge in its language, look carefully at the way the poets pair names. Leviathan has a land-bound brother named Behemoth in later Jewish imagination, and a sky-bound counterpart called Ziz, a bird so wide that its wings are like tents for towns. These three together make a menagerie of elements: sea, land, and sky, brought into vivid focus by monsters that no farmer or fisherman or archer could ever manage. The names are not pulled from thin air. They are drawn from the textures of the scriptures, where Leviathan rises when Job needs to learn humility, where Behemoth grazes like an ox made colossal by mythic magnification, and where the birds of heaven give a scale to the vault that cannot be measured by masonry. Together they remind the reader that the world is more than human convenience. It is a theatre of the divine, and in that theatre there are characters who will never bow to any applause less than that of their author. Return for a moment to the Hebrew usages and notice the finesse. When the book of Job puts Leviathan into its storm-lit courtroom, it allows the beast to breathe fire and to put a shine like morning on the eyes that glow beneath the waves. It describes the scales as if they were welded plates on a chariot of iron, locked so tightly that even air is refused. The point is not to draw a bestiary with measurements and weights. The point is to say to a suffering man that there are things in this world that his courage cannot master and his arguments cannot measure, and that the one who made such a thing is therefore beyond cross-examination. When the Psalms remember a crushing of many heads, they are not doing biology. They are translating fear and memory and gratitude into images that a singer can carry up the steps of the sanctuary. Among the sages of later centuries, the names multiplied and clarified. The rabbis spoke with relish of two Leviathans in the beginning, a male and a female, and of the decision of the Holy One to slay the female, so that the world should not be torn by a brood of monsters larger than the seas that birthed them. They spoke of the preservation of that flesh as a promise of a banquet in the world to come, the righteous gathered under a canopy made from the shining skin of what once terrified them. The names of Leviathan, Behemoth, and Ziz became a way to speak about the fullness of creation and its final reconciliation. The talk is exuberant and learned, and in every line there is a subtle reminder. The monsters belong to God. Their names are held on the divine registry. There is a way to read all this that turns every alias into a taxonomic label. That way leads to dust. The better way listens for the music of the names. Leviathan is the fear that has a face and a coil. Tannin is the category that says, the world contains categories we cannot catalogue. Rahab is the beautiful insult flung at empires that imagine themselves seaworthy beyond the decree of the Lord. Tehom is the solemn word that says, there is always a depth beneath whatever you think is bottom. Litan is the name you hear when you are standing on a foreign strand, and you feel the same shiver of recognition. The dragon of many names is a map of human awe. The Hebrew decision to call that awe toward God, rather than away from God, is the central difference that all the philology in the world cannot substitute for. You can stand on a quay and watch the evidence. A fisherman from the islands stares at the glittering backs of waves and calls their tantrum by a name his grandfather used and his grandfather before him. A sailor from the south repeats a prayer that keeps the same rhythm as the prayers burned into clay in an age before letters were written on papyrus and bound with linen. A priest from Jerusalem sings a psalm in which the Lord makes Leviathan for sport. None of them could sit in a room and agree on a single word for the thing they fear and love. All of them would nod if you said there is a monster in the water, and only the Maker tells it where to turn. Names are boats. They carry us out and back again. But the sea remains the sea, and Leviathan remains the thing that makes the sea more than a resource and more than a route. It makes it a sacrament. There is a further beauty in the Hebrew choice of names, and it has to do with how sound behaves. Leviathan is a word that begins with a liquid consonant that slides like water, then tightens in the middle as if the mouth had met a ridge of scales, then opens out again toward an ending that is almost a sigh. Tannin is all teeth at the start, and then a nasal that hums like wind in a shell. Rahab is thunder in the throat that breaks upon the soft coast of the final consonant. Tehom starts with a shoreline consonant, and then drops you through a vowel into an abyss. The names are poems before they are entries in a dictionary. They imitate what they signify. They are the beginning of wisdom in the shape of a sound. You will notice that in Hebrew there is never an invitation to worship the dragon of the sea. This is where the distance from the neighbors grows dramatic. In the Greek tales, a hero might flatter a sea god or bribe a monster with a sacrifice. In the Babylonian tale, the sea is divine and maternal and must be slain to make a world. In the Hebrew tales, there is only the Lord and the creatures. The sea is not mother. The sea is not father. The sea is a scene. It is grand. It is dangerous. It is beloved. It is the place where Leviathan plays and where human beings learn both fear and trust. The names are not amulets. They are reminders. They remind us that the first duty of a creature is not to be brave, but to remember who is in charge of the tide. Scholars who spend their days in cool rooms with shelves of dictionaries like to point out that even within Scripture the use of these names carries layers. In one psalm, Leviathan is a vanquished war trophy. In another, it is a pet in the hands of a majestic ruler who takes delight in watching his creation move. In Job, it is the unanswerable, that which makes the questioner swallow his questions. In Isaiah, it is a future target, a serpent whose remaining power will one day be taken away for good. The dragon of many names is also a dragon of many roles. None of those roles grant it autonomy. They grant it significance, which is altogether different. Significance is the honor a creature receives when its existence points beyond itself. If you sail farther around the Mediterranean and into the harbors where the Latin language builds its columns, you will find the word Leviathan traveling like a loanword that refused to pay its ticket. It enters sermons. It enters poems. It becomes a symbol for any force too large for a city to manage on its own. It becomes a way to speak about the weight of empire and the breadth of the sea and the scale of guilt that can drown a man who tries to carry it alone. When later ages take the word and apply it to a ship the size of a town or a political system as vast as a continent, they are not insulting the old dragon. They are admitting that the name still does what it did at the beginning. It makes us remember that some things are too great for a hand to hold, and that the right response is awe joined to responsibility. But the heart of our chapter is still the Hebrew Bible, and within that book, the many names serve a single end. They gather the fears and stories of generations and present them to the Lord. This is the liturgical genius of Israel. Where another people might build a shrine to appease a serpent, Israel builds a song to praise the one who tells the serpent where to sleep. Where another people might carve the dragon into the keep of a city and ask for mercy, Israel carves the dragon into a psalm and asks for wisdom. The names survive because the prayers were answered. The sea kept its borders. The shore kept its villages. The monsters that haunted the edges kept to those edges. The people remembered. They said the names in gratitude and in warning, as if to say, do not forget the scale of the world, and do not forget who holds the scales in balance. To finish, imagine a table of names laid upon a chart of the sea. In one corner is Leviathan, the coil and the crown of the deep. In another is Tannin, the category that catches every dim shape that slides past the lantern of a fisherman. In a third is Rahab, the proud sea given a personality so that the prophets may scold it into humility when they are really speaking about the pride of kings. Beneath them all is Tehom, not a monster but the theater in which monsters feel at home. Around the edges are the names of cousins and cognates from other tongues, Litan in the coastal north, the serpents of 7 heads whispered to be companions of the sea, the ancient goddess of salt water remembered by the rivers far to the east, the Greek Ketos whose bulk gives heroes something to do. The chart is crowded, yet there is a calm at its center. The calm has a single name. It is the name of the one who said to the waters, "Here and no farther." Names matter because they teach a kind of seeing. If you can say Leviathan, you have already confessed that there are things in the world that exceed you and that you do not need to be God in order to live well among them. If you can say Tannanim, you can grant that the sea has its own catalogue that will never fit inside your books. If you can say Rahab, you can learn to spot the swagger of empires and to predict their drownings. If you can say Tehom, you can look into a dark place without imagining that darkness is a god. The dragon of many names is a lesson in humility taught in the language of wonder. So the sea speaks, and the nations answer with their words and stories. The Hebrews answer with their songs, and Leviathan, hearing itself named in so many ways, turns beneath the waves, as if listening, as if amused that we should imagine that giving a thing a name is the same as putting a ring in its jaw. It is not. The ring belongs to God, the names belong to us, and they are enough to keep us honest, to keep the shoreline clear in our imaginations, and to keep the awe that brings wisdom alive in the mind. The sailors who made their living on the Great Sea learned early that fear is part of a proper outfit, as necessary as rope or sail. They nodded to the sun when it rose because daylight was a contract, and contracts are comforting. But the real terms of their labor were set below. When the swell changed mood without warning, when the water lifted in a long, thoughtful heave that had nothing to do with wind, when a keel shuddered as if something had taken it in 2 fingers and considered snapping it, the men at the oars did not argue with the weather. They remembered the name that lived in the black water, and they worked with a hush that had devotion in it. The sea was a temple without walls, and terror was part of its liturgy. Every coast had its way of telling the same story. On the quays of Joppa, the fishermen swore that there were days when the water turned to glass, and yet somewhere beneath that calm a body passed that turned the heart to crushed shell. In the harbours of Tyre, men who had seen more voyages than teeth said that sometimes the dawn rose from underwater, two small suns glimmering and sliding like coins beneath a curtain. Those were the eyes, they said, the old eyes that kept their own time. In little Phoenician coves, the boys were warned to keep their hands out of the tide pools, not because of crabs, but because even the smallest pool remembered whom it served and might drag a finger farther than its owner intended. Sailors are generous with invention, but this was not invention. It was the habit of speaking carefully when one knows that one is being overheard by an element that can swallow a city and cough once afterward. The Hebrew storytellers did not keep their Leviathan in libraries alone. They allowed it to walk the docks as rumor and travel with caravans as a proverb. They said that in the age when wise men traded proverbs, a crew chanced upon a fish so long that the horizon could not be found without stepping back. The creature announced itself as a minor thing, the poor relation of the deep, and added with bleak courtesy that it was kept alive only to serve as a morsel for Leviathan. The sailors were grateful to be in the presence of modesty and rowed away as quickly as gratitude allowed. You can hear the laughter in the telling, a dark laugh that keeps a hand on a blessed amulet tucked into a shirt. Another tale told in the market streets explains why the sea sometimes steams on windless days. Leviathan is eating. Its breath is hot, so hot that the waters boil like a pot that has been set over a cook fire. It is wise, added the storyteller, not to tempt the appetite of a creature that counts whales as small fish and takes its pleasure in making the deep white with heat. There were older sailors who insisted that the water did not merely boil. They claimed that when Leviathan rose to breathe, the ocean itself breathed with it, that an entire line of sea lifted and fell in a single long sigh, and that all the smaller beings felt their organs shiver. One man said he saw a slick of silver air riding the surface and thought it a shoal of fish, until he understood that he was looking at bubbles from the throat of a thing that could swallow a fleet and feel peckish afterward. He had a way of ending the story that pleased children and made men take a drink. "I decided to grow old on land," he would say. Then he would look at the sea as if daring it to be offended. Sailors are not sages alone. They are engineers who improvise with wood in a moving world. To them, Leviathan was not a philosophy. It was a schedule. You set out before dawn because dawn is the hour of distracted monsters. You watch the line where green water becomes blue with the concentration of a priest passing a hard verse, because that line can be a boundary drawn by the thrill of a passing body. You learn to read wakes and currents as if they were the curls of a language that does not love being translated. If a wake ran straight when there was no wind, you turned your head until you could no longer see it. You did not speak a name until land was in sight. You certainly did not boast. The sea has a way of making very personal arrangements with those who boast. The literature of the deep grows bold in the mouths of those who have returned. In the courts of sages, the tales picked up commentary as a ship picks up barnacles. Teachers with the salt not yet washed from their beards told of a day when a crew found what seemed to be an island in a strait where no chart admitted an island. It had sand. It had scrub. They lit a fire to heat a pot. When the pot began to sing, the island began to roll, and the men scrambled for the boat and pulled at the oars with the energy of newly devout men. The island submerged, and the sea shrugged, as if it had forgotten that it had ever been a place to stand. That day, said the traveling rabbi, we learned that islands can blink. The learned in the room smiled at the hyperbole and did not correct it. They knew that some truths are best carried in a jest that never quite stops being serious. Among the most cherished scraps of lore were those that brushed against the sacred texts and came away warm. There is the story, told with a wink, that Jonah did not consent to his fish at once because the first maw that gaped beneath him belonged to Leviathan. The great beast, it is said, had been waiting for the prophet with an appetite sharpened by a diet of smaller whales, and would have snapped him up like a sweet. Providentially, a respectable fish came by with its mouth open, and Jonah, who was never a fool for long, chose the second option. He spent his appointed days composing prayer and patience in that respectable belly, and yielded the sea monster to a future menu. The point of the story is not comedy. It is the conviction that destiny has better teeth than terror. Sailors learn to love lights. They count them, they catalogue their colors, they recite their rhythms as a monk recites litanies. They are quiet about other lights. There are nights when the sea writes its own stars, when the water shines at the touch of an oar and a school of fish becomes a constellation in motion. There are darker nights, far from any shore, when a brightness appears within the sea for no reason a man can pronounce. In those moments, a tale wakes up in the mind. These are the eyes again, the old eyes that see without needing the Sunday. The book of Job once said that the sneezings of Leviathan flash forth light, and that sparks leap from its mouth, and that when it moves, the deep looks like a pot, and the water under it is beaten white. A workman with a coil of rope around his shoulder does not expound such poetry. He stares into the shining, and he thinks about the friends he would like to see again, and he keeps his notions to himself. Ports breed practical religion. In the taverns at Ashkelon, a rough psalm was sung as men banged their cups on scarred tables. It asked mercy for those who go down to the sea in ships and do business in great waters. It remembered that God lifts waves until they are walls, and brings them down until a man thinks his skull will crack with the change. It said the sea is a test of prayer, because only prayer can find the harbor when the compass is confused. That psalm knows Leviathan without naming it. It knows the violence in the water, and it knows that the one who planted this violence as a warning also provides ladders out of it. The men who chanted it were not saints, but they understood that an hour on the open water is an education in obedience and in gratitude. As maps became more ambitious, they began to decorate their own ignorance. A chart is an expression of hope. To draw a line is to assert that a line exists and will be there again tomorrow. In the margins where there were no lines yet, the artists painted coils and crowns. They pretended to know the posture of the thing that might be found there. No one was fooled. The coils were a confession that beyond the known there are old obligations. The sea does not sign our papers. We sign hers. She allows us to pass. She may not. Either way, the decision is recorded deep where ink cannot go. The cartographers, for all their cleverness, went on drawing teeth at the edges, and the sailors who used their charts did not object. They had seen wakes that insisted on keeping their secrets. There is no society of the sea that does not pour a little drink into the water before the first cast of the net, or tie a token into the rigging, or nail a small charm into the mast above head height where the ordinary robber cannot reach it. The Hebrews were told by their law to avoid charms, and yet they brought phylacteries to the docks and tied the words of a blessing to their bodies, so that the body would remember the words when the mind was busy with the serious business of staying alive. They did not think this a contradiction. They thought it wisdom. One may keep the first commandment and still admit that the heart is steadier when the fingers are busy with a custom that says you have not forgotten the vocabulary of awe. Fear has a way of producing industry. Whole professions arose on stray facts claimed from the mouths of returning crews. There were men who sold boat names believed to be unappealing to what might be swimming below. There were men who made a living engraving sea serpents on amulets to remind a man that he had remembered to be afraid. In noble houses far from the water, there were courtiers who collected tales of an animal that breathed smoke and demanded that their bards craft similes with it. The image traveled. Draped in metaphor, it entered sermons and laws. In some courts, the king carried a seal with a fish that had far too many teeth. The message was not subtle. It said, "I am large enough to be feared." It said, "I can keep you safe from large things if you keep me satisfied." The preachers who heard such flattery did not always argue, but they wrote sermons that quietly corrected the appeal. The seal on the heart, they said, should belong to a different sovereign. Occasionally a ship came home peeled to its ribs, as if some huge mouth had taken a taste and decided that planks were disagreeable. A captain whose beard had gone white in a single week said that his crew had watched a ridge rise under the water for so long that they began to call it by pet names. The ridge broke the surface and became a long rolling back unlike any whale they had ever seen. They turned the ship about and discovered that turning has no value if the sea would prefer you to go the other way. The back folded and a jaw appeared. A spray of warm breath blew across the deck, and a boy lost his eyebrows. The ship groaned and shivered, as if embarrassed to be at the center of so much attention. Then a miracle occurred. The beast moved away with the idle grace of a nobleman refusing an inferior meal. When men speak of miracles, they usually mean that they were spared and cannot account for it. The tellers did not forget the curious line in the Psalms that says God made Leviathan to play. They told it as consolation when terror had worn a crew thin. The most dreadful thing you can imagine was made for play. Not for murder, not for sport that you would call blood sport, for play. The sea has its festivals, the deep has its ballet. No one is invited that breathes air. We observe, and we shiver. It is enough. If the Maker delights in the curling of his most dangerous fish, if there is laughter in heaven when a coil becomes a graceful loop, and the loop becomes a leap that no eye has seen, then perhaps the point is not that we are menaced. Perhaps the point is that joy exists in places we cannot live and does not require our applause. There were ports where men swore they could smell Leviathan before they could see any sign of it. A heavy sweetness would come across the water, like pitch warmed in a smithy with strange herbs. It would make the throat tight and dry the tongue. On such days the boats did not untie. Old women with eyes like chipped slate would stand at the end of the breakwater and spit into the water 3 times and say an old praise that began with the words, "You are not a god," and ended with the words, "and therefore we are not undone." Their sons were embarrassed by their mothers and returned to their games. They would learn later that the sea respects old women who speak theology. Once or twice in a lifetime, a village on a calm strand awoke to find a carcass on the tide line that looked like an argument. It was too big to name and too twisted to measure. Men stood and counted vertebrae until numbers felt like a pastime for children. Air that ought to have been fresh stank of victory turned to ash. The kin of priests came with knives to see if anything useful could be taken from this gift that wanted to be a curse. A little oil, a few bones that could bear the weight of a roof in a poor house. They said the rest to the fire and prayed a prayer that avoided the name they most wanted to say. These remains were never admitted as evidence. The wise refused to confuse a rumor with a relic, but the boys who watched the smoke said to their grandsons that they had seen what happens when the sea coughs. In all of this, terror was never the point. It was the teacher. It taught small things that matter, like how to hold your breath and your tongue at the same time, and larger things that save a soul, like how to be brave without being stupid. It kept hubris from hardening into a habit. The sight of a sudden line of smooth water moving against the wind taught modesty more directly than any moralist with a podium. The sailors understood this before the philosophers did. When asked why they continued to go out, they answered with honest arithmetic. There were mouths to feed. There was the pride of a good catch. There was the fact that the world is not all land, and the human heart grows cramped if it pretends otherwise. And there was also this, harder to admit and yet plainly true. The terror itself was a kind of summons. To live rightly is to acknowledge what can destroy you and set out anyway with reverence. So the old world kept its tales and its careful practices. Nets were thrown with a blessing. Sails were reefed with a psalm half spoken between teeth. Charts were kissed in the corner before they were folded along the crease. Mothers took the salt crust from a maiden voyage and put it in a small jar on the mantel, so that when the wind spoke at night and the house complained in its timbers, there would be a reminder that the family had already agreed to be a family that trusted both providence and prudence. The name of Leviathan walked through those houses like a guest of honor who never climbed the steps. It stayed on the threshold and looked in, and then went back to the sea. The greatest change that terror brought was in the way people prayed. Before the sea, prayer was request and thanksgiving. After the sea, prayer included adoration, not of the thing that frightened them, but of the one who gave that thing its leash. The sailors learned the difference between pleading and praise. They learned that to praise a sovereign who enjoys the vital coils of a dangerous fish is to admit that the world can be both perilous and good without contradiction. They came home and taught their children to say a simple sentence before sleep. The sea is large. God is larger. The child slept. The parents sat awake and listened to the last slow wash of water on stones and felt that sentence widen the heart. By the time the next generation took the tillers, the stories had hardened into wisdom. The deep is living. It remembers. It is not a place where men should act like owners. Remember the name that lives under the keel and do not speak it carelessly. Remember the one who holds that name and speak his name always with clean hands. Put the boat out gladly. Pull her in humbly. When the eyes shine under the water, do not lean too far over the rail in the hope of a better view. You are small. This is not an insult. It is the beginning of safety. If the wave grows a sudden ridge and runs without wind, turn your face from it, as one turns from the inner room of a temple, unless invited. And still, with all this caution and all this awe, the stories did not end in despair. They ended in a vision that belongs to the same mouth that once whispered the first boundary. There will be a day, the prophet said, when the long terror will be brought to heel, and the old coils will lie slack at last. Until then, the sea keeps its manners, because it was taught them once at the beginning, and it remembers the lesson. Leviathan still swims. The sailors still go. The harbors still fill at evening with boats that come home creaking with fish and with gratitude. The terror abides as a kind of sacrament, a reminder that we live by permission, and that permission is a mercy renewed with every dawn. When the speech from the whirlwind turns to Leviathan, it is as if the sea itself has entered the courtroom and laid its bulk upon the floor. The voice that addresses Job does not flatter human craft. It asks questions that turn every rope into twine and every spear into a toy. Can you draw out Leviathan with a hook? Can you press down its tongue with a cord? Will it make many pleas to you? Will it speak soft words? Will you put a leash on it for your girls to lead about? The questions arrive like waves, and each one leaves the decks of human pride slick and dangerous underfoot. The Book of Job, that strange masterpiece of patience and stormlight, lingers over Leviathan the way a fire lingers over seasoned wood. The description is not a few swift strokes. It is patient and merciless. Consider the first feature it praises, the mouth. The door of its face is a gate that no hand can lift. Terrible teeth are set in ranks, and the opening of that mouth is enough to unman the steady. Its jaws are a shrine to force. Inside, a pressure like the weight of the sea compresses darkness until it can be exhaled as light. The poet says its sneezings flash forth light, and from its mouth go burning torches. Smoke issues from its nostrils as from a boiling pot. The breath of the creature kindles coals. This is no crocodile weaving quietly along a reed bed. This is a furnace wedded to a mind, a moving engine of heat in an element that laughs at flame. Armor is the next matter. Where other animals have skins, Leviathan has policy. Rows of scales are locked so tightly that even air is refused. Each plate is a door with no seam. Each seam is a vow. The shield does not admit the idea of a gap. The poet counts these plates like a smith admiring a wall of bronze, and then declares that the wall is so complete that no arrow can find an angle. No spear can find a fault. Iron is regarded as straw. Bronze is rotten wood. Arrows turn to reed stalks in mid-flight. Stones thrown from slings become the kind of thing a boy tosses across a pond for play. You are meant to remember the proud inventory of weapons that kings carried into battle, and then experience the delicious humiliation of that memory. None of it matters here. The sea monster has rendered the armory irrelevant. There is also talk of the neck, and this too is a sermon. Strength lodges in that column. Terror dances before it. The folds of its flesh are joined together as if stitched by a craftsman who understood pressure and had no interest in delicacy. Its heart is cast like stone, firm as a lower millstone. Courage is a virtue, it implies. But in the presence of this creature, courage becomes a miscalculation. When it rises, the mighty are afraid. When it heaves, wave and warrior lose their agreement with gravity. Men who wrote lists of triumphs and victories feel the ink run on their tablets and watch their hands shake. This is not exaggeration. It is instruction. It is the reminder that existence contains a force that can turn the spine of a hero into thread. The poet loves the water under the beast as much as the beast above the water. Under its belly are sharp fragments that cut like pottery shards, and wherever it moves, it leaves behind a signature. The deep that had looked black becomes white with churn. The wake shines, so that one might think the abyss itself had grown old and taken on the color of hair. The image is tender and terrible at once. The deep is ancient, yet this passing makes it look older still. The world puts on a grey sheen in the path of power. Every sailor who has watched a clear lane of churned water stretch away into blue understands that the poem is not indulging in fantasy for its own sake. It is transcribing a thing that can be felt in the knees when a deck rises and refuses to come down. Weapons are invited to the page one by one for the pleasure of their dismissal. The sword touches and has no effect. The spear introduces itself and is ignored. The dart attempts to define the scene and is uninvited. The javelin shakes in the hand of the thrower, and the shaking is the most action it will see. Even the tools of close work are mocked. A hook cannot find purchase in a jaw that snaps like the hinge of a gate designed by a god. A ring cannot be forced into a nose that breathes mist hotter than a spring in an earthquake country. You cannot stitch a rope through the tongue of a creature whose tongue is an anvil. The poet toys with these images and then drops them like shells emptied of sound. You are left with a single conclusion. Human technique ends at the shore of this reality. There is a passage that delights the cruel humor of a certain kind of reader and instructs the pious more gently. Will you take Leviathan as a servant forever? Will you play with it as with a bird? Will you tie it for your maidens? The line conjures an absurd domestic scene, a royal courtyard, a length of ribbon, a giggling procession of girls leading a creature whose breath can boil a cove. The image has a sting. If you cannot turn the most terrible body in creation into an ornament for an afternoon, then perhaps you should adjust the way you imagine your reach. Pride wears silk and rings. Pride adores pets. The king over all the children of pride will not wear your ribbon. We are told also what happens to communities when this creature stirs. The mighty cry out. The guards at the walls forget their posts and look seaward. The stone hearts of professionals thump like wet hides hung on a line. Men who have trained their whole lives to stand still when death enters the room find they have stepped backward without deciding to. Panic is not mentioned as a moral failing. It is described as a physical fact. The breath of Leviathan is not only hot enough to taste, it is also heavy enough to move entire towns of lungs. There is a strange courtesy in the description. The poet refuses to pretend that this is a fight worth staging. Not because the fight would be short, though it would, but because calling it a fight would be to pay a compliment to human strength it has not earned. The text tells us that hope of capturing it is false. and even the sight of it is enough to lay the strongest low. The word hope here is not the tender hope of a child. It is the experienced expectation of a hunter or an engineer. That expectation is dismissed. You do not take this beast. You do not pen it. You do not process it. You do not make of it a trophy to lean against when guests visit. If you draw near, you do so as a student, not as a master. There is one more detail that the poet hides in the roll of images like a coin in a fold of cloth. Leviathan esteems itself. It sees all high things. On earth it has no equal. It is king over all the children of pride. The final title is not given lightly. Pride is not only the swagger of a soldier or the smooth voice of a courtier. Pride is the deep habit of thinking that everything will answer to us in time. Leviathan is a check written upon that habit. It is a living monarchy of refusal. It refuses the hook, the rope, the bribe, the leash, the bargain. It refuses to live on land. It refuses to pretend that power resides where it does not. You can read these lines by lamplight and feel the metaphysics turn under your chair. You can take a slower pleasure and think about the world in which this poem was first heard. Metal was costly. Rope was precious. Courage was praised in a way that belonged to economies where life and death depended on shoulders and oars. To that world comes a speech that collects every proof of human potency and sets them in a row, then smiles and sweeps them into a sack. The lesson is not that the tools were foolish. The lesson is that tools are local and that reality has rooms in which your tools are trivial. The comparison to known beasts is a common sport. Some say crocodile and close the book with a satisfied look, as if the Nile had solved the riddle for all peoples. The poem will not stand for that reduction. It borrows the crocodile as a brush, then paints a figure that will not fit back into that frame. Fire from the mouth, smoke from the nostrils, a wake that whitens great waters, an armor that makes iron and bronze ridiculous, a spirit that looks upon the proud as if they were reeds in a marsh. The crocodile is fierce. Leviathan is a theater of divine rhetoric. To shrink the latter into the former is to mistake astronomy for a candle. The older wisdom literature loved lists. The speech to Job collects the lists and inverts them. Consider a catalogue of hunting techniques: hook, line, net, spear, harpoon, noose. Each has a logic and a history of triumphs. Each has a song in a family line about the day it made a man into a legend. Then listen to the voice that says, "Try your tricks, and watch how the sea remains unmoved." The list becomes a litany of defeats, and the defeats become a liturgy of a different kind of knowledge. Not that man is worthless, but that man is surrounded by value that resists his categories. The poetry also plays with spectacle. In its path you see a gleaming track. One might think the deep had grown hoary. One might. The line allows you to feel the double mind of the witness. On the one hand, this is the natural effect of heat and churn on water. On the other hand, an old mind that has known terror sees an omen. The deep looks aged by a single passage. The world can be made to appear frail in an instant by the movement of something older, stronger, and entirely itself. A modern listener might reach for chemistry. The poet reaches for reverence. If you need one final demonstration of the way Leviathan stands beyond mob rule, think of the crowd. Imagine a host of hunters. They speak among themselves about cordage and points and barbs and how many hands it will take to hold the line fast when the first pull comes. They laugh the way men laugh when they are trying to make a thing smaller by speaking loudly. Then picture the first emergence. A ridge of water becomes a back becomes a tower of throat. The tower opens. The color of the sea alters. The smell of a kiln passes across the bows. The world rearranges itself around a fact. The crowd ceases to be a crowd. It becomes a congregation. The sermon is brief. You cannot. The dismissal is kinder than it sounds. Go home. All this might seem like pageantry mounted for the sake of scaring a good man into silence. It is not that. The terror is not a prank. It is an instrument tuned to a key that the human shape must learn if it is to live at peace inside a creation it did not invent. Leviathan holds the note. The men with spears and nets are wise when they learn to listen. The sage is wise when he allows his sentences to shorten in the presence of the long body that rises and falls like the breath of the world. So stand with Job at the edge of speech. Hear the questions arrive like surf and fall back into foam. Look out over the wrinkled back of the deep and consider a creature whose every feature has been described not to invite your hunt, but to end it before it starts. No bargain, no leash, no hook, no name that you can pronounce as ownership. Only a presence that fills the page until the page is a shoreline, and you are a figure small enough to love the shore because it saves you from the sea. There is a moment in the book of Job when words become weather. The courtroom of complaint is still there, the benches of grief and the railing where petitions are set down, but something shifts behind the scenery. A wind arrives that is more than wind. The voice that speaks out of it does not explain the arithmetic of suffering. It rearranges the furniture of thought. It asks questions, not the kind that wait for a tidy answer, the kind that invite a man to look up and find that the sky is larger than he remembered. Have you commanded the morning since your days began? Have the storehouses of the snow been opened to you? The questions roll like surf until Job is standing on a private shore where the deep breathes, and he is very small and very awake. Only then comes the creature that turns all bravery to chalk. Behemoth lumbers through as a prelude, a vastness of land and muscle that dines on grass and cannot be frightened by rivers that fling themselves at him in spate. But the lesson is not about herbivores. The lesson arrives when the sea stands up in a body and the divine voice says a name without saying it. Can you pull the king of the deep to the surface with a hook? Can you make treaties with a power that does not know your language? The interrogation is merciless and kind in the same breath. It does not crush Job. It relocates him. He has been arguing as if the world could be folded into a brief. The whirlwind will have none of it. The world is not a brief. It is a theater where a dragon swims at the pleasure of its author. What humbles Job is not humiliation. It is revelation. He has shown what it means to be a creature in a creation that contains Leviathan, not a pet universe, not a safe terrarium where nothing larger than a cricket is allowed. A real world where the sea still remembers the old swagger and must be told where to stop, and where a single beast embodies the truth that there are corners of existence that will never submit to human handling. The change in Job is audible. Once he spoke from the ash heap with a fire that matched his pain. Now his sentences have learned to kneel. I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, he says at the end, but now my eye sees you. The seeing is not a vision of shining halls. It is the sight of order holding in the presence of something that by all rights should undo it. He has seen Leviathan by the light of a voice, and has discovered that awe is a better instrument than accusation. There is a temptation to call the speech a divine display of power for its own sake. The temptation should be resisted. A tyrant would come down in a storm and shout about obedience. The voice from the whirlwind does not shout obedience. It teaches perspective. The catalogue of marvels from mountain goats to constellations is not a list of trophies. It is a reading lesson. Job is being taught how to read the world as scripture. He is being shown that the grammar of creation begins with boundaries and ends with praise. Leviathan is part of that grammar. It is the letter that means there is more here than use and more here than fairness measured by our scales. It is the big capital that says God is God and we are not, and that this is very good news even when our hearts are broken. In this light, the famous description of the sea monster is not a natural history. It is a spiritual geometry. The plates of its armor close so tight that air is banished, because there must be at least one fact in the world that cannot be pried open with tools. The breath that kindles coals reminds us that even water is not proof against fire when God chooses to write paradox into the margins. The wake that turns the abyss to hoarfrost is a sign that power leaves a track, and that the tracks of power make time look old and us look honest. The question, will you make it play with a chord as with a bird, is comedy, but it is holy comedy, the kind that cures vanity by making it laugh at itself. This is not cruelty, it is therapy by grandeur. The humility that follows is not the collapse of a man, it is a restoration. Job has spent long chapters pressing his case with meticulous care. He has demanded an audience and has been given one. He asked for an explanation. He received instead a vision. The vision reorders him. He still grieves. Grief is not an error, but his grief is no longer a verdict rendered against the universe. It is a sorrow carried within a frame that has proved strong enough to hold Leviathan. If the frame can hold that, it can hold Job. His repentance is not self-hatred. It is the recognition that he has spoken about things too wonderful for him, which is another way of saying that his words were not large enough for the room he was in. To repent of that is to grow. There is a wisdom tradition that runs like a clean current through Israel's literature, and its refrain is simple. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Fear here is not flinching. It is accurate seeing. It is the steady knowledge that the world is not an extension of me, and that the center of weight is elsewhere. Leviathan is the practical course in that curriculum. It puts fear into a shape that can be imagined and felt. It says to the carpenter, and the mother, and the king, and the poet, there is something under all your boats that will never obey you, and that is not a defect in your world, it is the sign of your safety. If the sea obeyed you, your pride would drown you in the shallows. Because it does not, you may learn to pray. The effect on the soul that has absorbed this lesson is visible in 100 small ways. The man who has been humbled by Leviathan no longer treats tools as sacraments. He treats them as gifts. He no longer believes that a clever contrivance will save him from every storm. He knows that storms answer to a higher weather. He is gentle with animals because he sees in the gaze of a sheep a trace of the same truth he saw in the glitter of that unseen eye below the keel. He does not despise the ordinary. He understands that the domesticated and the wild belong together in a world that is loved by its maker. He stops asking to be told the reasons behind every wind that ever knocked down a wall. He asks instead to be given courage and patience and the power to keep his tongue from judging God. Communities that live with this knowledge acquire manners. Their prayers change. They are no longer only lists of requests and receipts of thanks. They begin with adoration. You are the one who tells the sea where to stop. You are the one who feeds the lion and counts the ravens. You are the one who enjoys the play of the monster we fear. The praise is not flattery, it is alignment. When they praise, they find their size again, and it fits them beautifully. Law changes too. The people who have knelt in the presence of power that is not theirs are reluctant to become petty tyrants over the weak. They recall that the one who stands above Leviathan also hears the cry of the poor, and that if the poor are not sheltered, the sea will one day shelter them, and the villages will be empty. The teachers who came later took comfort in this order. They did not imagine that God kept Leviathan for dramatic effect. They understood that the creature's existence was a mercy. The world needs at least one thing that cannot be bullied. The world needs a reminder carved into water that terror is not sovereign, and that the only hand that can hold it is the hand that made it. Some among them said, with gentle audacity, that God could have sent great beasts to punish men at any time, and did not. The restraint was part of the lesson. Power that is not used is a better teacher than power that is simply displayed. The presence of the monster and the continued existence of harbors is a sermon preached in two voices that resolve into a single chord. Do not suppose that the humbled become timid. The opposite is true. When a man has stood in the wind of those questions and has learned to bow without collapsing, he discovers a new courage. It is not the courage of conquest, it is the courage of loyalty. He keeps faith when explanations fall silent. He does his work with care because care is a form of gratitude. He speaks more slowly because words are no longer ammunition. They are instruments tuned to a world that is larger than his certainties. He becomes patient with mystery. He does not despise inquiry. He simply refuses to treat knowledge as a throne. The lesson travels beyond the desert and the farm and the city square. It reaches ships. Sailors who have prayed the sea into their bones understand Job without needing to read him. They know that a wake can be a signature. They know that the line between survival and disaster can be as thin as a prayer whispered while a mast is groaning. They know that reverence is a safety harness. When such a man comes ashore and goes to the sanctuary, he does not sneer at the psalm that speaks of God making Leviathan for play. He smiles and nods, and perhaps, if he is brave, he tells the story of the night he saw lights within the water and felt the world tilt politely around a fact. Eventually, the narrative returns to Job and to the quiet aftermath. The ash heap is still ash. Loss is not reversed by a lecture, even a divine one. But Job is altered. He has been brought to the boundary line and has found that it is real and good. He has learned that understanding is not the crown of faith. Trust is. He places his hand over his mouth because he knows that sometimes the truest thing a mouth can do is close. His friends are gently corrected, as pedants often are, and he is commended for having spoken of God what is right by refusing at the last to compress the holy into the small print of a human case. The story does not cancel sorrow. It enfolds it in a music that stretches from the morning stars to the dim places where scales lock so tight that even air waits outside. The sages will say in later centuries that learning to fear the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and that wisdom is a tree of life. The root of that tree goes down into an old seabed. Its sap smells faintly of brine. The fruit it bears tastes of clarity. In its shade, a man can admit that he does not know why certain winds blow the way they do, and yet he can bless the one who rides upon the storm. He can remember a beast he has never seen and feel grateful that it exists, because its existence means the world is not tailored to his pride. He can kneel without surrendering his mind. He can stand without hardening his heart. When we say that Job was humbled by Leviathan, we do not mean that he was terrified into silence by a tail of teeth. We mean that he was welcomed into a larger house. The ceilings are higher there. The windows face towards sea and desert and sky. On the mantel are 3 gifts: a stone to remind him of the heart of the great beast that cannot be softened by any hand but one, a small coil of rope to remind him of the tools that have their place and no farther, a shell that holds a sound to remind him that awe is a music you can carry with you when no instruments are playing. He leaves the house changed. The world is the same. The difference is that now he knows where to put himself within it. Prophecy is not weather forecast, and it is not daydream. In Israel, it is a way of seeing that cuts through the present like a clean river through stone and shows the bedrock beneath. When the seers turned their faces toward the sea, they did not squint for omens in foam. They listened for the memory of creation and for the promise that the one who set the boundary for the waters would complete what had been begun. In their hearing, the old serpent of the deep was not a rumor from fishermen or a poetic flourish. It was a certainty given a season. There would be a day when the last coil would slacken and the long terror would be ended. The poets had already kept memory alive. One psalm sings of a victory before men kept calendars, a time when the heads of the sea dragon were shattered and the carcass was portioned to the wanderers who had never smelled salt on their hands. That song is not a museum piece. It is a pledge. If such things were once done, they can be done again, and they can be done finally. Another song watches ships cleave sunlit water and then glances below where the great creature plays by permission, as if to say that joy and judgment belong to the same author. These lines gathered in the hearts of prophets like dry wood laid ready for a spark. When the spark came, it wore the shape of a sentence as simple as a blade, a voice that had denounced kings for their violence and comforted widows for their grief, said that a day would arrive when a sword not made by men would be lifted. It called the beast by its old titles, the fleeing serpent and the twisting serpent, and promised the dragon in the sea would be slain. The words do not wobble with uncertainty. They have the quickness of a hand that knows how to cut a knot. The prophet sets no hour and gives no map to the place. He gives a surety and leaves the sea to tremble in its trough. The city heard and did what cities do. Some laughed. Some nodded and returned to their trade. Some went home and lay awake and tried to imagine a horizon without dread. The king listened with a careful face, because kings cultivate careful faces. The priests wrote the sentence in their scrolls, in a script that took its time, because sacred words should never be put down in a hurry. Children learned to say the difficult names and liked the feel of them in the mouth. The word for that blade was repeated until it grew familiar. The day of the Lord, not any day. The day when the one who spoke morning into being would bring night to what had no business living in the dark any longer. There is a habit among modern readers to treat such talk as allegory. The ancients were more supple. They knew that symbols have bodies. They understood that the dragon is both the beast in the abyss and the swagger of empires that come foaming across borders as if they were waves. In the oracle, both meanings breathe. The serpent is a nation swollen with pride that will be humbled. The serpent is also the ancient thing below that lends tyranny its confidence by whispering that chaos is eternal. The promise answers both. The oppressor will fall, and the deep source of fear will meet a limit that is not temporary. This is why the prophecy is not politics dressed up in poetry. It is theology with a spine. The older stories warmed themselves at this fire. In the wisdom of teachers who wrote between temple and exile, a pair of monsters are set aside for the end of the age, the land behemoth and the sea serpent, held like actors, waiting in the wings for the last act. One day, they say, the command will go forth, and the blade of the Holy One will meet them, and what once threatened the world will feed the world. The image is not gluttony made sacred. It is order expressed as supper. Fear itself will be served on plates. The canopy above the tables will be made from the shining skin of the slain dragon, so that the guests eat beneath a roof that once inspired terror and now gives light. A different stream of vision speaks of a day when the deep is summoned to give up its dead. In that calling, the old serpent has no voice. The voice belongs to the one who measured the waters in the hollow of a hand. What rose once from the sea as a taunt will sink as a memory. The bones of empires will be sifted, and the bones of the monster that egged them on will become chalk for children to draw a calmer shore. In such visions there is always a sword, yet no smith is praised, no forge is visited. The edge is the divine will personified. What men could never shoulder will be borne by the one who made the shoulders. Imagine for a moment the prophet at his work. It is night in Jerusalem, and the desert wind carries dust through narrow streets. Somewhere, a lamp gutters. He has spoken hard words against violence and soft words to broken people, and now he writes a line that will be remembered wherever the sea is feared. On that day. 3 words, and you can hear the city shift its weight, that mixture of dread and hope that makes mortals very honest. He goes on to call the serpent by the names used on other shores and in other mouths, and then he writes the verb that seals the line. Slay, not pacify, not tame, slay. No treaty with what kills joy. No bargain with what chokes prayer. An end. The announcement travels like a rumor the world wants to believe. Sailors carry it to harbors that smell of cedar and pitch. Shepherds carry it along wadis, where only their flocks listen. Judges carry it as a private anchor when they know they will face a case that will break their heart. The line enters ordinary speech. Men say it without thinking when the sea throws a mood at the stones and then calms at evening. Women say it under their breath when a child wakes confused by a dream of black water. Old men say it when they remember that not all battles can be fought by hands. There will be a day. Prophecy does not love timetables, yet it gives scenes. The scene given here is spare, a sword, a serpent known for fleeing and twisting, a dragon in the sea, a death. Like all good scenes, it invites the imagination without giving it rope enough to strangle the meaning. The danger in too much detail is that listeners will mistake a map for a promise. The prophet refuses to become a cartographer. He gives a pledge and leaves the path to the one who keeps pledges. This is why these words last beyond the regimes that rise and fall while they are spoken. They are anchored in character, not in schedules. It is worth noticing how gentle the promise is for those who must live with the sea while they wait. Nothing is said that would make a fisherman despise his work or a child fear the shore. The prophecy does not slander creation to make a point about salvation. It honors the world as a place where even the monster can be said to play before its final summons. This is the mark of the Hebrew vision at its best. It does not crown terror. It domesticates it by placing it within the economy of a holy future. The end will not be an argument. It will be a feast. Some of the learned have wondered whether the old seven-headed image lingers behind the words. If so, the line about heads broken like pottery in a psalm becomes more than history remembered. It becomes a rehearsal for the last act. Whether the number is 7 or 70 is irrelevant. The point is completeness. Everything that belonged to the ancient fright will be addressed. Every place where the coil tried to tighten around a human throat will be loosened. The final cut will not leave a stump that sprouts. The root itself will be lifted from the salt bed where it thought it could hide forever. In the long season between speaking and fulfillment, the promise bears a practical fruit. It teaches courage without bravado. Those who believe it go to sea with prayers and return with gratitude. They do not taunt the deep. They thank the one who keeps watch above it. Those who tend the land do not imagine that their fields are safe because the world is tame. They imagine their fields are safe because a boundary was spoken once and will be spoken again. The promise makes daily work honorable. It is not a license to sit in the door and wait for the sky to split. It is a reason to work without despair. Night returns to Jerusalem. The scroll is rolled and stored in a chest that smells of cedar and age. The prophet sleeps. The sea keeps its heavy breathing. Somewhere far from any shore, a light moves under the water where no lamp burns and no human eye can follow. The old serpent turns in its trench and dreams whatever monsters dream. It does not know dates. It knows only hunger and habit. Over it all, the promise hangs like a star seen by no eye yet, fixed and patient and merciful. When the day comes, there will be no trumpet for the monster to hear and ready itself. There will be only command, and the sea will part not for an army, but for a corpse that used to be fear. We who read centuries later are tempted to dress the line in our own costumes. We make it a metaphor for our inner turmoils, or a picture for the fall of tyrants we already dislike. That is not wrong, but it is smaller than what was said. Keep the larger frame. The Holy One announced that the last enemy from the first dawn will meet a final dawn of its own. The sea that learned its manners at the beginning will learn quiet. The world that has carried a bruise under its ribs since the age of stories will heal. The flutes and the drums of celebration will be heard across shoal and desert and vineyard, and the children will ask what is a Leviathan, and the old will smile and say, a lesson we were given so that we would never again confuse ourselves with God. The day does not arrive like a parade. It comes the way deep weather comes. in a silence that lengthens until the world realizes it is listening. Birds pause in mid-song as if the air has thickened. The sea draws back an inch at a time as though the shore were a line of scripture that must be read again with care. The old promise has ripened. The hour that was announced in a single sentence now stands at the edge of the waters and waits until even the wind agrees to be still. There are signs that would sound theatrical if they were not so plain. The sheen on the swells tightens to the look of hammered metal. A faint brightness shows within the mass of the sea where no sun can go. The ocean breathes, and the breath is warm. On the far horizon something rises that is not wave and not weather. It is the slow architecture of a body. A ridge becomes a breadth. The breadth becomes a height that makes memory honest. Leviathan comes up from its old corridor with the certainty of a mountain that has remembered that it can walk. It does not rush. The creature that frightened 1,000 generations has never needed haste. It turns its coils with the ritual grace of a dancer, beginning a piece that was learned before language. The eyes are steady lamps. The scales lie in ranks that make metal look like an idea. Mist spills from the vents of its skull, and the mist glows at the edges the way steel glows before a swordsmith lifts his hammer. The sea under it pales to the color of old hair. There is a taste in the air that is part smoke and part salt, and part the memory of fireside stories told to keep fear well behaved. No army meets it, no priests with amulets, no hunters with machines. The old texts were careful about this, and the care is kept. The contest is not between two forces groping for a crown. The crown is already worn. The one who set the boundary speaks, and the speech is a blade. There is no alloy in it. There is no forge mark. It is the will that once said light and meant it. It is raised without flourish. It falls without sound that ears can hear. The stroke cuts the day from its husk and shows what the day was meant to be. Leviathan replies as it has always replied. It rises, and the sea rides its spine. It opens the gate of its mouth, and the dark is pressed into brilliance and spat into the air as sparks. The heat of its exhalation lays a white path across the surface. Its neck becomes a tower, and terror gathers in front of it the way gulls gather before a storm. That is as far as it can go. The creature that breaks ships by breathing discovers a horizon that will not move. The sword advances by remaining entirely itself. Imagine the impact without noise. The edges that have never yielded meet the edge that never dulls. What scales did to iron they cannot do to this. Each plate that once deflected every hope of a spear receives a verdict. The verdict is yes to an end. The coils thrash as if the sea has become a field of ropes. The heat turns the topmost water to a skin that puckers and then disappears. The ridge that was a back becomes a line, and then a stripe, and then a suggestion. The eyes that made sailors think of buried dawns flicker as if they had remembered the morning star and seen someone standing beside it. The old multi-headed memory reappears not as metaphor but as a last convulsion of pride. Bodies that seem like crowns rise and fall and are cut away in order, each one made ridiculous by how completely it was once believed in. The tail finds the bottom and tries to brace. The bottom lets it. The sword does not need to hurry. It is true that the sea once learned a lesson. It is truer that it now remembers the teacher. The deep uncurls around the dying length, as if grateful to be itself again. There is no cheer from the shore. The moment refuses applause. A rumor of relief passes through every creature that has ever depended on borders. In cities, men look up from their accounts and do not know why their shoulders have loosened. In villages, women with basins of water at their feet glance toward the west as if hearing a familiar name spoken kindly. Children forget their quarrels for an hour and play a game that requires no winner. The world does not celebrate, it exhales. At sea level, the labor is precise. The sword, that is not a thing of metal, works not as an axe but as a surgeon. The task is not merely to stop a heart, it is to take apart a history. The plates are lifted from one another, as if the years of fear were being unstitched. The bones are unseated with a competence that belongs to the one who set them in place. The blood that would have scalded a fleet runs back into the deep without harm, like dye poured into a river that turns to clear water 3 strides later. The mouth that kindled coals closes with no drama and no resentment. A long coil slackens and becomes just length. On the ocean floor, creatures that never see daylight feel a pressure change that is like a prayer. Schools of fish veer as if a net had been taken away. Whale roads that once detoured around a trench resume their old path, as if greeting a lane that had been closed for repairs. The shoals above green water fill with life that looks new because it is not sheltering from a rumor any longer. Even the air over the waves seems to have had a weight removed from its most ordinary molecules. Those who are fond of spectacle might ask for thunder and pillars of fire and celestial messengers. They receive instead a world put back into true. The day begins to behave like a day. The sea remembers the line. Nothing in creation becomes less itself. Everything becomes itself without the lean of dread. The end of the monster is not the beginning of boredom. It is the renewal of play that does not involve murder. It is the return of a calm that is not indifference. The body is drawn from the water. No human hand hauls that freight. It rises the way a thought rises in a mind that is paying attention. The surface that once shuddered at the passing of that bulk now holds it up with an ease that is comic. From beaches and headlands, men and women see a shape that their ancestors described with trembling, and they do not tremble. They watch as the remains are attended by the same will that once assigned names to winds. Strips of hide catch the light like sails. Great spans of membrane fold as if remembering how to be canopy and not menace. The old tales begin to stir around the edges of the scene like guests arriving. Seabirds settle on the water and do not rise. They bob as if invited to a kind of court they never knew they had helped sustain by screaming over carrion. There is a pause that teaches patience. The deep falls back into its daily breathing. On shore, the first fires of evening are kindled without hurry. The world resumes. Only the oldest trees and the oldest stones know that a sentence spoken in an old city has been kept in full. The last gesture belongs to the one whose sword did the work. It is not a flourish, it is a setting aside. A portion is preserved for what will come next. The hide that once gleamed like plates of night is set where light can pass through it. The flesh that was once a promise of disaster keeps its promise in a different key. The bones that held the pressure of the abyss without complaint are ordered like pillars. This is not revenge, it is harvest. Somewhere far inland, a teacher will later say that this is how the world was always meant to be redeemed, not by unmaking what frightened us, but by transfiguring it into service. The sea has learned quiet without losing its voice. The people have kept courage without needing bravado. The promise that hung like a star has lowered itself to the horizon and become a line that even a child can trace with a stick. Night comes late that day. The dark is clean. The constellations over the water do not look nervous. A fisherman sits on a low wall and feels a tilt in his chest where terror used to live. In a city square, a magistrate lays aside a case that had grown knotted and finds that his mind is not tangled. In a farmhouse, a woman opens a window and the sound of the surf is not a warning, but a lullaby. No one speaks of Leviathan because no one needs to. The lesson has become weather. So ends the longest quarrel on earth, though it never was a quarrel in the sense that men argue over fields. It was a confirmation. The one who began the sea has affirmed the sea. The one who allowed a monster to swim has decided the hour of its last turn. The sword is put away where words are kept. The deep turns in its sleep and dreams of fish. Creation is at rest without losing its appetite for morning. There is an old promise that does not sound like a verdict. It sounds like dinner. After the sword is sheathed and the sea remembers its manners, the storytellers of Israel lean toward the future and find a table set on the far shore of history. The scene is not gloating. It is gratitude plated and poured. What terrified the world is now brought steaming to the table of the world to come. And those who trembled at the edge of the waters are invited to taste a peace that can be chewed and swallowed. The banquet has a name whispered with a smile by teachers who enjoy the sparkle in their students' eyes. The Feast of Leviathan. In the telling, it shares the menu with Behemoth from the land, and sometimes with the great bird called Ziz from the open sky, as if the three vast theatres of creation were each bringing a course. But the jewel of the meal is the sea itself made harmless and generous. Once the coils have slackened forever, the flesh is portioned by hands that first taught the waves to stop. This is not a hunt that ends in a boast. It is a sacrament of order. The carving knife is providence. The place where the guests assemble is described with the kind of particulars that make listeners lean closer. The canopy is made from the hide of the dragon. It is cut and hung so that its sheen becomes a ceiling. Light passes through in a way that no cloth weaves can imitate. The elders say that the radiance will be cool and steady, a daylight without glare, and that the whole company will sit beneath a roof that once drew fear like iron draws lightning, and will now give shelter without weight. Some imagine the canopy stretched like a tent of meeting across a hill. Others see it as 1,000 panels raised over streets and courtyards so that all the nations may eat in one long festival. Either way, the lesson is the same. What was weapon now becomes weather. Wine flows, not the sour sort that turns a man foolish, but a vintage that belongs to a cellar older than memory. The prophets had already spoken of a feast of rich food and aged wine on a mountain where tears are wiped and shame is taken away. The rabbis who love a good seam between texts stitch that mountain to the sea and let the cups be filled with what the world has been waiting for since its first morning. The fragrance is the fragrance of rest. It smells like a garden that has finally refused every thorn. The flesh itself is described with a tenderness usually reserved for fruit at harvest. It is firm and pale and sweet with the salt of the element that once gave it power. Some say the portion will strengthen the meek without making them proud. Some say it will teach the tongue the taste of courage without the heat of fear. No one says it will be ordinary. The plate set before each guest is a memory made edible. Terror is chewed and becomes vigor. Awe is swallowed and becomes praise. The company is carefully chosen but not small. Righteous is the word used with care. And it does not mean proud or narrow. It means those who wanted the world as God wants it. It means those who kept faith when it was not fashionable. It means those who learned to raise children and build houses and keep promises while the deep breathed under the keel of their lives. Generals arrive and sit beside shepherds. Merchants whose weights were honest sit beside poets whose lines were clean. There are fishermen who once watched lights move beneath black water and turned home safely because they kept a psalm under their breath. They raise their cups to the light that now passes through the canopy and find that the light raises them in turn. Blessings are said with a gravity that knows laughter is part of holiness. Blessed is the one who brings bread from the earth, and fish from the sea, and joy from the end of fear. A portion is lifted, and a prayer remembers the day when a psalm sang about heads broken in the waters and food given to wanderers who had never walked a beach. Another blessing remembers the line about Leviathan made to play. We did not misunderstand it, the officiant says. The world was meant for play, but not for cruel play. Today the play is safe again. The laughter that follows is quiet and clean. There are stories told at the tables, for a banquet without stories is only a pause between labors. An old man with a face salted by many voyages tells of a wake he once saw that ran straight against the wind. He had been unable to speak for an hour. Tonight he tells it to a child who has never seen the sea fearfully, and the child listens as if hearing a fairy tale whose moral is gratitude. A woman who buried a son in the year of a storm tells of the sentence that held her when no sentence else would. The sea is large. God is larger. She lifts her cup, and the world around her seems to nod. The knife keeps moving. The portions are not meager. No one hoards. It is a table without envy. The old masters used to say that where envy is absent, the food keeps its flavor. So it is here. The savor of the meat does not diminish with the number who taste it. In some versions of the story, the guests discover that the more they share, the brighter the canopy becomes, until the city shines as if it were midday at midnight, and no one is afraid of that light because it does not expose shame. It heals it. If you ask practical questions, the storytellers answer with practical grace. What of bones? They will be set as pillars in halls that will not fall. What of the skin that remains? It will be fashioned into garments that do not wear, and into banners that do not boast. What of the jaw that once opened to turn water into fire? It will be displayed as a gate that frames fields safe from locusts and storms. What of the teeth? They will be set into tools that teach rather than tear. None of this is cruelty. It is the craft of redemption. Nothing is wasted that can be turned to use. There is a poetry in the seating. Some imagine that those who endured the sea sit nearest the platter, as if to honor the intimacy of their old fear. Others say that the seats are set by the arithmetic of mercy, and that the first will be last, and the last will be first. All agree on one quiet certainty. The one who carved the first portion will take a place among the guests, not as a diner who requires praise, but as a host who likes to watch the faces of the fed. It is the smile of a gardener who has waited for a fruit to ripen, and now tastes it, and finds it exactly as hoped. A cantor stands and sings words older than any of the silverware. He tells of a day when death will be swallowed up. The line is sung slowly, and 1,000 minds note the tact in the verb. Death does not swallow. It is swallowed. The monster is not the last eater. The last eater is joy. Cups are lifted. Dishes are passed. The singers continue with the song of a city that is safe, and a people who do not learn war any longer. The rhythm settles on the table like a hand on a child that has just stopped crying. This banquet is not escapism spun into gold. It is instruction about the nature of victory. The hope that lives in the Hebrew imagination refuses to be only a courtroom decree. It wants to be supper with friends. It wants to be a lamp lit under a canopy that never leaks. It wants to be the sound of knives working without threat, and of laughter that does not make anyone small. The victory promised by the prophets is not sterile. It is convivial. It repairs hunger with plenty, and fear with a taste that will never fade from the heart. What of the nations that once told different stories about the sea? They are invited. The tent is too large to be a single tribe parade. The poets had room for this in their lines long ago. All flesh will see it together. That means Greeks who spoke of a sea beast and needed a hero, and Phoenicians who made fortunes on waters they could not command, and Babylonians who once imagined a god made from salt and night. They will eat together. They will bless together. They will discover that the taste of peace is not a dialect. It is a language everyone knows when it is finally served. Last of all, when the knives are cleaned and the singing softens, there is a walk under the canopy. The light is clear, and the air smells of salt without threat. Children run and chase the patterns on the shining roof, as if they were following shoals that can never drown them. An old mariner stands very still and cries without shame. A widow feels a weight leave her ribs and does not rush to catch it. A scholar mutters a verse to himself and finds that the verse has become a doorway. The night is not anxious. The world waits, not for danger, but for sleep that is deep and kind. In that waiting, the meaning of the meal is sealed. It is not a feast upon an enemy, as if cruelty had changed masters. It is a feast upon fear itself, cooked until it turns to nourishment and carries none of its old poison. The canopy above bears witness. It was once armor against every spear. Now it is shelter for every friend. The sea nearby breathes with the steady rhythm of a creature tamed by love without being crushed by it. The guests disperse to homes that will not be taken by storm, and the lamps along the lanes burn without watching for a gust. So the promise ends with plates and songs rather than with speeches. The last taste on the tongue is not iron but sweetness. The last sound in the ear is not the roar of a breaking wave but the murmur of a city at peace. And if someone lifts a cup and says to the maker, "You have turned terror into supper," the answer is a smile that needs no words. Stories do not stop living when the last page is turned. They change houses. They move from the shore to the city, from the fishing boat to the study, from the mouth of the sailor to the hand of the scribe. Leviathan began as awe in the throat of a people who knew the taste of salt and the discipline of prayer. In the centuries that followed, the serpent of the deep shed skins of fear and put on the garments of metaphor. It entered synagogues as a mystery, academies as a problem, pulpits as a warning, and eventually the modern street as a common noun for anything too large to manage. The monster did not die. It learned to stand for things. In the rooms of the sages, Leviathan kept its first identity and gathered others. The rabbis loved its presence in the banquet at the end of days, and then asked what that feast might mean beyond a menu. Some said the meal is an emblem of perfect justice, where the terror that once stalked the margins of life is made to nourish life. Some said the canopy of shining hide is a parable of illumination, that once we lived under armor, and afterward we shall live under glory, and that light itself will be the roof of our streets. Others climbed a little higher and spoke more boldly. Leviathan became a figure for the hidden things that bend the heart. It became a symbol for the impulse that coils and whispers that the world is chaos and that nothing binds. The promise that the Holy One will slay the twisting serpent came to mean that the cords of that dark persuasion will be cut, and that desire itself will be taught to love the borders of goodness. The poets of Israel wove Leviathan into their festival songs. A few lines glimmer in hymns that welcomed the new year or remembered the Exodus. The words borrowed the awe of fishermen and gave it a liturgical shape. God feeds the world, they sang, and God delights in the play of his creatures, and God will one day end the play that harms. When a congregation answered those lines, they were confessing more than belief in a banquet. They were confessing that the terrifying parts of the world belong to God and will be reconciled to his will. To speak the name in worship was to lay it gently in a hand that could hold it. Mystics took up the serpent and laid it upon the immense diagram of their thought. In their visions, creation is a ladder of lights that pours down from the divine and returns to it. And within that ladder there are regions that resist and regions that shine. The old beast, they said, swims on the far edge of the dark river where resistance is strong. It is both a real creature and a teaching. It is a sign that power without praise becomes its own prison. They told daring tales about the soul of the world tasting a sweetness higher than any flesh, a joy named after the very fish whose body is reserved for the righteous. There is a calm audacity in those lines. The mystic refuses to forget that the monster is a creature, and then insists that the meaning of the creature rises far beyond its bulk. When the scriptures of Israel traveled into the Greek and Latin world, the image of Leviathan changed accent. Christian readers turned Isaiah and Job in their hands and listened to the echoes in their own book of visions. A dragon with many heads already lived in their last pages, a creature cast down by a war in heaven and cast out upon the earth. It did not take much to hear the old serpent in the new song. The fathers of the churches spoke a language of struggle in which pride is the root of ruin, And there, at the end of Job, stood a king over all the children of pride, a beast that refused every leash and laughed at every spear. For many, Leviathan became a face for the ancient enemy of souls. It was not a second god. It was a creature turned against its maker and used by a darker will. The promise that God would break its heads and slay the dragon in the sea became a promise that evil itself would be ended. Religious readers today still find more than one use for the serpent of the deep. In the synagogue, a teacher may point to the lines in the Psalms that say God feeds the world and God made Leviathan to play, and ask whether our fears have grown too proud. Perhaps some of what we dread was always a part of a world that is good. Perhaps our calling is not to erase dread, but to set it within praise. In the church, a preacher may turn to the end of Job and tell a congregation that the victory of God over evil is not an athletic contest, but a declaration that puts fear out of office. Elsewhere, a writer on politics may warn that any Leviathan we build on earth to hold back chaos will eventually look in the mirror and admire its own coils, and that therefore the only safe sovereign is the one who can cut pride without growing proud. Art continues to make use of the outline. In films and murals and fiction, the unseen thing under the surface is shorthand for crisis. When a composer wants to make the audience feel the size of a threat, a low motif rolls under everything, like a swell beneath a calm sea. When a painter wants to show the peril of greed, a mouth opens in a corner of the canvas, and something glittering teeters at its lip. The old beast has become a grammar for power and peril. You do not need to know the psalm to understand the image. You only need to have stood on a beach and felt the pull of a sea that does not care that you are important. And still, for all these uses, the oldest meaning remains. The name reminds us that the world is not ours to edit. It declares that there are forces and sizes and freedoms that answer only to their maker. The symbol keeps the lesson of humility alive, even when pride invents new tools. Perhaps that is why the word endures when so many ancient names have faded. It was forged out of awe and given to a people who knew what to do with awe. They did not build a shrine to the monster. They built a song to the one who lets the monster breathe and will one day tell it to stop breathing. To speak the name today is still to join that song. If you stand at evening on a pier and listen, you can hear how the word works. It gathers every giant together. It gathers dragons and despots, corporations and empires, passions and storms. It lays them at the feet of a quiet sovereignty and refuses to panic. Then it turns and helps us speak about our own hearts. There are coils in us. There are heats that boil what ought to be calm. The promise that the serpent will be slain becomes an invitation to hope that our inner tempests can be gentled without being erased, that power can be harnessed to love, that order can be more than an argument, that one day fear will be served up as supper, and its teeth will be set into tools that heal. So the journey of Leviathan from monster to metaphor is not a retreat into safety. It is an advance into wisdom. The symbol has not emptied the sea. It has taught us to sail it, to pray while we work, to admire what we cannot own, to distrust bigness that serves only itself, and to hunger for the day when the deepest terror will become a canopy of light. This is why the serpent still swims through our speech. It keeps our sentences honest about the size of things, and our hopes disciplined by the memory of a sword that belongs to someone else.